morning, you all. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited. I'm so excited about this year of This Is My Story. And our heart with this ministry, as we've said many times, it's a ministry of transparency. I didn't want to lead the women's ministry. I didn't want it to be a sense where you guys come and hear a Bible study from the pastor's wife because, I've got it all together, because that's not true. And I feel like in my life, I've learned from people who are transparent about their failings, about their shortcomings, about their regrets, and of course about their victories as well. And so I really wanted this ministry to reflect that. I wanted it to be something where us as women, not as leaders, women in their lives, maybe you're retired, maybe you're a young mom, maybe you're a single mom, maybe you've suffered loss, maybe you've suffered sickness, we can all learn from that. And Lena asked, who do you want to teach the first one? I'm like, well, I'm always, the on-call. If nobody else can fit in, we'll do it. And so we had somebody, and she goes, do you want her to go first? And I was like, I'm sorry, I really feel like God wants me to start. And I'm like, I don't want to do this, but I've been looking so forward to this. I'm going to talk about my struggle with depression, which has been with me for, now it's been way more than half my life, since I was a teenager, which is like a million years ago. So, but I'm going to tell it, but I'm also going to tell it through the use of art. And that's what I also love about This Is My Story. It's not just us talking, but it's a way to express yourself in any way you want to express yourself, whether it's through art, whether it's through pictures, whether it's through performance, however it is you want to tell your story. So join with me. So this is called My Story, the Art of Darkness. For as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. There was a short stint where I wanted to be a truck driver, and then another short stint where I wanted to be a stay-at-home mother of 10. But thankfully, I got past that. So I still remember the first poem that I wrote. I would think I was a first grader. I remember where I was sitting in our backyard when I wrote it. And whenever I would feel an emotion, I felt prompted to express it in writing. And that never really changed for me. During every step of my life, I would write. Never the Dear Diary kind of person, structured thing, but it was more for emotional processing in my life. As I got older, I finished high school and I became a missionary, and I would write emails to my parents. That's when email first came out in the 90s, and it was way too expensive to call. I lived overseas, so I would just email them all the time. So that kind of became a journal of sorts for myself, but for myself, I always wrote creatively. And I mostly wrote what I call vignettes. They're kind of like, I refer to them as windows into moments. It could be an encounter with somebody, something I saw, a conversation, a relationship. They would be very short, only a few pages or less, but they would encapsulate that moment for me. I wrote vignettes about my experiences in Hungary and the people I met, and I tucked these stories away, hoping that one day I could become a writer. So while I loved learning in school, I also loved being a missionary, and those two always fought against each other in my heart. I went to school on and off in my 20s when I would come home for furlough, maybe take a semester of courses here and there. And then when distance learning came on the scene, I started doing that in the first couple years of our marriage when we were still overseas. But after getting married and starting a family, I decided to get my degree. And my kids were about 7 and 5 at the time. And after having accumulated enough credits here and there, and I was able to test out of a language requirement, which is a whole nother story. They let me do it in Hungarian, even though that didn't exist. I was persistent, and I found a professor who was Hungarian and who tested me out, so I didn't have to take a whole nother year of language. But I was going to be able to earn my degree in creative writing in about 2 years. So while this seemed like a great opportunity, it was laden with a lot of baggage. This was a time of intersection. That's probably a nice way of putting it. I don't know what else to call it. It could,
Collision.
collision, that was the next word. It could most accurately be called a collision or a car crash or a series of unfortunate events that led to this moment of change in my life. Change that had to happen. Armando had been laid off from his job. It was when the recession hit. And we lost our house, and we had to move into his mother's house, my mother-in-law's house, up in the San Bernardino area. We had no money. We only had Medi-Cal for the kids. Our marriage was a mess, and we were trying to decide where we could school the kids because it was a very rough area. And we were afraid to put them in public school because their last name is Garcia, but they're pretty fair. And I didn't feel like it was going to go well for them. So we really struggled with what to do. We couldn't afford private school. So it was a point of change. When I decided to go back to school in my mid-30s, aside from all the material and real life issues we were dealing with, I was carrying a huge secret. Half my life I had been spent dealing with, and living under the weight of depression. It came on me when I was about 16 years old, and it just never left. It started with sadness in high school and through my early 20s, but it later became a factor in my marriage and a barrier to enjoying my kids. I'd grown up in the church, Calvary Chapel in fact, but at the time psychology was very, very looked down upon. The approach to mental illness was the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater. All mental illness was of the devil, and most likely depression you were feeling was a result of secret sin in your life, some hidden sin that you were harboring, and medication was absolutely out of the question. So with this came the most damaging instructions that I was given as a believer. Look deep inside and see what wicked way you're hiding and what secret sin you're tucking away. Thing is, when someone has mental illness, all we do is look inside.
Amen.
But the bad part is that your mind's eye is broken and nothing is seen in the light of truth because the mind plays tricks on you. Obviously, if someone is in blatant sin, the Holy Spirit comes knocking, okay? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about depression. I'm talking about when your brain is broken and when your feelings and thoughts are like looking through a kaleidoscope. So while you can see beautiful color, and there are some images that you might recognize, it's fractured and it's broken. And that view lies to you about what is real and what is true. So I battled this for years, and I was terrified of God. I couldn't live up to his expectations. He must hate me and know that I'm lying and that I'm pretending to be a Christian because of my depression. I was terrified that I had committed the only unpardonable sin, grieving the Holy Spirit. I felt not left out, but totally rejected, like I was at the door of heaven banging to get in, but the door stayed locked and shut, and I was simply unworthy, and my faith wasn't real, and it wasn't enough. So here I was, a deeply depressed mother with an opportunity to go to school, fulfill my dreams of writing, and possibly get a job as a result that was going to better our family's financial situation. But in the darkness, this opportunity opened up not only a whole new creative world for me, but a door into healing as well. As soon as I became a student, I got health insurance, and I headed right over to the campus clinic for medication. I'd had enough. We also decided to homeschool our kids, which sounded like an insane idea when your husband is working 3 part-time jobs, and I decided to go back to school. So we found a program that worked. And when it came to registering for classes, I had to work around my kids' hybrid school schedule, and so it allowed me very little flexibility in the classes that I took. I would drop them off at the homeschool group class in Riverside and head right across the freeway to UC Riverside and stuff as many classes and as much homework into that time, those 2 days a week that I could. I couldn't be too choosy, so when it came to classes and I needed to meet a requirement, I signed up for a class that was called the graphic novel. And I thought, graphic, like dark and disturbing. Okay, I'm kind of into weird stuff. That's kind of cool. I like that idea. I've always been a bit of a weirdo, so there's that. But when I got the syllabus, it was full of comic books. I was so upset. Nobody had told me that a graphic novel was a modern term for a comic book. And superheroes are just not my cup of tea, except for Iron Man, he's kind of cute. But other than him, no. But the first day of class, a whole new world opened up to me. And I learned while there were comic books that are, superhero and sci-fi driven, there are also what could be described as illustrated novels. And this is what I began to study. The only thing I love more than writing are books themselves. And so to tell me that there are well-written novels with art included was completely mind-blowing to me. There's a book called Persepolis, the autobiography of a girl growing up in Iran, caught between two eras of freedom and control in the 1970s and 80s. Another book I loved was called Blankets. It was an autobiography of a young man who was struggling with God in the midst of an abusive childhood. Mouse, it's critically acclaimed. It's a fantastic book. The account of a couple's life as Jews in Nazi Germany told by their son. And the Nazis are portrayed as cats and the Jews as mice. There's Fun House, a girl growing up in a home that's attached to a mortuary that her father runs. And it's also dealing with sexual identity as all these family secrets begin to come up. Okay, so these obviously are not the happiest books in the world. Okay, I'll give you that. But my point is that they were real and they were human. And while they were amazing stories on their own, the use of art brought them vividly to life. To have literature and art together was mind-blowing for me. So naturally, as part of the class, we were not just reading these, but we were writing short comics as well, and I absolutely fell in love. In fact, I loved the class so much that my professor let me take it again, and she assigned new novels so that I wouldn't have to take any repeats. And in fact, I took it over summer school, and I don't know if my daughter remembers, but I would bring her to class as well when it wasn't too adult. But I ended up being the first person ever at UC Riverside to submit a graphic novel as a senior thesis. So illustrating my writing not only helped me to get my degree, but it offered a creative outlet because it became therapy for me and a form of healing. One of the criticisms that I always faced in my writing when we would sit in workshops and everybody just kind of lays into you and tells you exactly what they think of your writing, they would say it wasn't grounded. So the reader, they would be going nicely along when suddenly my writing would go into another realm. And it's referred to as fantastical realism, and it's great when it's done well. But I hadn't yet mastered it, and I still haven't, but I'm enthralled with that idea. But the nice thing about it was that my art would help to tether my story or tether my reader and give them a visual and kind of hold their hand as they walked through the story. So this is when I decided to write my own story. And as I began to write my journey out of depression, the use of art allowed me to not only express how I felt, but to show the reader what living in my broken brain was like. I was able to combine the reality of life in words with the unreality that was constantly playing in my mind. So I'm not a fine artist, and I have never been trained in art, but the beauty of it is that you don't have to be. I don't like rules. I've always been rebellious. Don't tell me what to do. And I've never had the formal training to know what is right when it comes to art and what is wrong for that matter. So I just kind of forged my own way. And also I'm very frugal, and I believe that necessity is the mother of invention. So I like to use whatever I have on hand or can find in thrift stores. So while I employ all kinds of art mediums in my work, I was able to use collage and watercolor mostly in the story that I'm going to share with you. At the time I was writing and illustrating it, we lived near Loma Linda Medical School, and I was able to find old used anatomy books at the thrift stores. And this was really important. I really wanted to use physical images because I wanted people to understand that the struggle with depression is in the physical and not necessarily just in the spiritual. So it was very important to me. So you can just kind of look at the art, and I'll read this to you. So this is my story out of depression and into the grace and rebirth of God's healing power. So the story is called 365. So summer. It was jagged, rusted, and violating perfect. I could see it from my balcony. The water drained with its corrugated sides and warped mouth like the faces children make when they play. It sat on the edge of the parking lot to catch the melting snow and take it down the hill and avoid further erosion or dirt around the slanting trees. But it was summer now, hot with the smell of pine on the verge of combustion. My baby was sleeping on the bed in a tangled mess of sweaty sheets that only a child could find rest in. The hair near his scalp was darker, saturated with perspiration, while the tips were blonde with traces of summer. Beads of sweat dotted his nose. His eyelashes always made me marvel, so long and enviable. When I was little, my grandmother used to read my palm, and she would tell me I had a very long lifeline. As a child, I received this with wonder, but she never told me that I was born without a success line. Not every hand is graced with this line that travels from the ring finger and then down the palm. When it's visible, it indicates happiness, but one without the other can only produce a rut worn deep with sorrow, very long sorrow. I thought about creating my own line, a line cut deep from the base of where my hand rested, and then down the palm and up my arm. I would create my own happiness line, since fate hadn't. I looked back out the window and the temptation grew, gnawed at me like it did from time to time. I thought how easily it would cut through the skin of my wrist, perfectly, quickly slicing through and letting the warm life seep out. It would drain quickly enough. The tool was perfect, but the setting wrong. Nobody wants someone killing themselves at church camp, especially not the pastor's wife. The irony would be thicker than the crusted red left behind. It didn't mean that the brokenness didn't exist. This was just not the July afternoon to expose it. It had been there since I was a teen, this depression that seeped in, at first a weightless presence, and then with a heaviness that was stifling and crippling. It gradually sewed itself to me stitch by stitch, like the shadow of Peter Pan, except unwanted. The thread was flesh-colored, so it was easy to hide and distinguishable by no one. I couldn't let it show because I wouldn't be allowed to medicate it with anything other than prayer. It would have been seen as a label, a permanent branding of sin, evidence of a hidden transgression that would have been prayed out and purged, but never accepted and healed with magic pills and opaque orange bottles. I looked back at my son with his rounded shoulders, like the manly mirror of his father, but with a tenderer spirit. He slept with the imperceptible pounding of a perfect organ against his ribcage. I wanted to see him grow. I wanted to see both my kids grow. I wanted to be there when his shoulders broadened and grew and his voice deepened, and when he would choose to love me, not just with the spontaneous kisses of a child, but with the understanding and conversation of adults. I turned back and sighed, not today. Hopefully not ever, the violent end of self-mutilation and the stigma of a mother who didn't love you long enough to stay. Fall. I began to feel the string tightening, pulling to its end almost beyond its strength, beyond what it was made to handle. My tone was on pitch, and then again it went sharp. Now it's so high that the neighbors' dogs bark when I walk by. They try to jump the fences and follow the high pitch of my pain. I've taken to swimming to deaden the pitch and drown my ears from the monotony of their barks. I silently skim beneath the surface and turn my head to raise my nose for fresh air and go back down again and hide between the bubbles and waves and hidden molecules of oxygen. Parts of me were warped from all the swimming, the swelling of waterlogged sadness that only becomes more obvious once I've dried off and my despair bulges and creaks in all the wrong places. More alone than ever, I felt driven to do what nobody else would do for me or with me or next to me. So I called. How do you tell somebody you need help? How do you tell someone that your burden is so heavy that it was hard to lift the receiver and whisper words of such deep need that the pages of a dictionary ran out before a suitable fit was found? My name was added to a digital list of the sick to be seen within a few weeks. By the time I hung up, my sorrow had receded enough to quiet the canine howling, and a sweet silence fell over the neighborhood for the first time in months. Winter. I finally got in to see the doctor. I lay on the table. I guess it was a table. It wasn't a bed. It wasn't a couch. And I was keenly aware of the fact that when I had delivered my children, I had to lay on something far harder than this. So I laid there and stared at the mobile that was hanging over my head. It was a cheap mobile with red plastic hearts hanging from it, as if reminding me why I'd come here. Love has brought you. It hung oddly juxtaposed with the STD posters covering the wall, every wall, a strange double message, love and genital herpes. All confidential, shame but no name. Under the hearts gently swaying from the air vent, I remembered that it was Valentine's Day. The doctor came in and we talked, and I reached for the Kleenex over and over, burying myself beneath the soggy paper tissues and sadness, the weave of their fibers sagging beneath my grief. The doctor appeared to be at a loss and afraid I was going to off myself. You know, if you get desperate, if it comes to that, call 911. I think to myself, if I got that desperate, I'm not calling 911. That's the point, right? But I smile and tell her, don't worry, that won't happen. She hands me a prescription because that is what I really came in for, coping, in pill form. But when she hands me the paper, I feel like a failure. Failure pills. The pharmacist tells me that it may take 2 to 8 weeks to feel better, but doesn't mention staying away from sharp objects in the meantime. I guess they don't joke about stuff like that. He does mention possible side effects, quote, may increase the risk of suicidal thoughts, dizziness, drowsiness, agitation, confusion, and death, end of quote. I think I'd have to be crazy to take this stuff, and then I remember that's a given. So I sit in a busy coffee house among the scent of brewing beans and push down the childproof lock on the orange bottle and slip the pill into my mouth. I didn't even hide it because I was certain I was entering the majority of the medicated, bandaging secret wounds and waiting for the dissolving skin of the pill to release its magic beads. I imagined them disappearing into my bloodstream, and before I could blink, they were in my brain, tricking my neurotransmitters into sending messages of engineered happiness to my nerve cells for them to embrace. Over the weeks, the pills dried my mouth and woke me from my sleep, desperate for water. I felt like a salted plum hanging in one of those cellophane bags at the checkout stand in Mexican markets, looking dusty and ancient, like shriveled parts of old men. Insomnia kept me for weeks, with dilated pupils like an addict who does anything for reprieve, anything for fabricated balance that frays at the edges all too quickly until it's completely unwound. And you are left with useless, limp threads, but I was happy. Prozac. It's amazing how much stability they can fit into such a tiny pill. Spring. I went to my required therapy for the first time. It was actually the first time I'd been to therapy since I was a child. When I was a kid, we went to a family counselor, and I remember he had a Volkswagen Rabbit, and while we were there getting to know each other and talking, he mentioned he was divorced. That puzzled me. You're divorced? I asked as a curious 8-year-old. Yes, he replied, probably in that understanding soft voice that therapists have. Then why are you a family counselor? I retorted, completely irritated that the obvious logic was lost on every adult in that room. But now I sat as a broken adult in the deep, soft leather couch, clutching the pillow on my lap. It took me about 5 minutes to realize why people are addicted to therapy. There is something healing about somebody listening to you without judging you, even if you have to pay them to do it. So willing to help, the quiet nodding of the head, the lack of eye contact, and the periodic grunt indicative of mutual understanding that makes therapy, well, therapeutic. "You're grieving, you're not depressed," he concluded as I poured out my heart. "Grieving what?" I paused, thinking it was an odd verb to use when nobody had died. "You're grieving the loss of hope." He was right. The last few years had taught me that love was a fictional noun, and it struck me strange that the lack of something could create such a weight. I think the myth of love had created a vacuum for regret to hide inside. Regret unpacked its bags and made me its primary address, and planted a garden within the fertile soil my tears nourished. Its roots grew deep and uprooted my faith in God. Once my faith was gone, there was nothing to nourish a dying heart, so it shriveled and it forgot to beat. I looked down and saw all the cracks and crevices in me where the mortar of hope had fallen out, vacant strips in some places where a large chunk must have fallen out and been left somewhere unretrieved. I imagined a trail of dust behind me, with pieces of me now floating on the wind and long ago swept into dozens of dustpans and discarded. I told him that I hadn't been talking to God lately. Actually, it had been months. I knew he was there, but I was giving him the silent treatment, my weapon of choice. I wanted to blame it all on God. He, being sovereign, had brought me here. The predestined broken paths established before the foundations of the earth, predestined for brokenness and trash heaps with swirling dust particles of me. I felt like Job's wife, urging her husband to curse God and die, but I wanted to do the cursing and dying, mostly just the cursing. "I'm angry at God," I admitted. My therapist replied with a smirk. "Do you think it's any easier for God to win back the heart of a woman than it is for a man?" "I suppose not." Summer. One day I felt different, and there appeared knobs on my back beneath my shoulder blades. They grew daily, and the skin stretched over them until it was opaque and white feathers poked through. The frayed and broken parts of me were gently sewn together with the handiwork of infinite patience. The seams were visible, but in a new place. I wanted them that way, without a false veneer of fabricated perfection. My wings began to unfurl, and the missing puzzle piece of emotional stability fell right into place. The medication delineated between truth and feeling, separating what I had always envisioned as Siamese twins. I stopped crying and hiding myself in the shower to let the hot water wash my pain away. I felt normal. I'd forgotten what it was like to be normal, not to shed tears because of traffic or want to end my life because I burnt dinner. I could smile with my kids and believe in love, not the love of whimsy, but truthful love, the kind that's scuffed and makes you look beautiful through the cracks where flaws are actually treasured. And you want to come home and wake up next to his familiar smell and long black lashes. God was patient, and he allowed my wings to grow in time and strengthen. I feared every day that he would push me out of the nest and make me fly and conquer winds far beyond my strength, just to prove my love for him. There was no violent rush of omnipotence. His silence reminded me that due to his sovereignty, he dwells outside of and above everything, even my idea of him. He quietly whispered that he was patient to win back the heart of this broken woman. Thank you.